let's talk about project governance. Or is it governance of projects? Well, actually, that does make a difference. Project governance is the framework by which you control one project. At least that's my take on it. Governance of projects is the overall framework by which an organization directs and controls its projects. What is governance? It's one of those high-level terms that's been bandied about quite a bit over the last 10, 20 years. Do people really understand what it means? Well, corporate governance defines the rules by which an organization conducts its operations. This means that it includes things like enterprise risk management strategy. It includes a definition of relationships between the various levels of organization in the company. It talks about the structure through which objectives are achieved, and so on and so forth. Now, governance of projects, of course, is a subset of corporate or organizational governance. It defines how projects are directed and controlled. Where did I get that definition from? Well, actually, we look at the Cadbury report back in 1992, which said that corporate governance is the framework by which organizations are directed and controlled. So, translating that to projects, it makes sense that governance of projects is the framework by which projects are directed and controlled. And of course, it must align with corporate or organizational governance. The principles of governance of projects. First of all, that every project has a business justification, that there is clear executive accountability for the project, that there are defined authorities, that there is a clear decision-making structure, that there is transparent communication or a mechanism for transparent communication, that there is direction for efficient use of resources. Some folks might say, why do we even need a governance structure for projects? Why don't we just apply the corporate governance structure? Well, because projects are unique and because certain things have to be applied in a rather unique way. And then, of course, there's the situation where you might have a project taking place outside of the typical corporate structure. It might be a joint venture with another organization, for an example. Well, which governance structure applies then? Organization 1 or organization number 2? So let's start with business justification. A clear business justification means that every project has a business case. That can be formal or informal, but there has to be a business case. The business case could be simple. We are performing this project because an executive CEO demands that it be performed, and we don't have a choice to say no. That's still a business case, and we should still have it preferably in writing somewhere so that if something happens to that executive, then the reason for having that project all of a sudden disappears, and we're aware of that before we start heading too far down that path of performing that project. That benefits are identified. Of course, it's really good if somebody tells us why we need to have this project. Sometimes the benefits are very clear. If we want to stay in business, we have to do this project because there's a regulatory requirement we have to meet. But somebody has to write that down. So if that regulatory requirement changes, we remind ourselves we should go back to that business case. Ownership of those benefits is identified. The other elements to include things like business risks. All of that is included in a business case. Executive accountability. What does that mean to you when it comes to projects? Too many organizations implement projects and say, that's it, it's up to the project manager, I'm out of here. When it's done and finished and successful, that's when I get involved again. The executive level has to remain involved in a project all the way through its life cycle. So what does executive accountability mean to you?
Support throughout the project.
Right.
They provide resources.
Good.
That the executive will be involved.
Excellent.
That it's going to be successful.
Absolutely. When we talk about executive accountability, we are talking about one distinct person, we call him the project sponsor, who's going to be accountable for that project at the executive level. We would like that person to provide us with oversight and direction. That project sponsor owns the business case at the end of the day. It may indeed be the project customer or funder of the project. That sponsor gives authority to the project manager and access to resources. That sponsor authorizes phases in the project, allows the project to continue, especially for those longer term projects where the business environment might change. We like to look at Prince 2 for some of the responsibilities of a project sponsor, although Prince 2 calls that person the project executive, because there's some very good language in there about what a project executive should do for a project. Now, in some environments, that becomes a bit challenging to identify who that one person is who's responsible for the project. The person who's funding the project may not be the best person to whom a project manager could go for assistance, advice, and oversight. And as such, we might create a specific structure with defined authorities so the project manager understands roles and responsibilities at that executive level. So here's one example, again, an extract from Prince 2, where we have a project manager with the project team, and that project manager does answer to one distinct project sponsor, but there is a board of people, usually 2, 3, 4. We wouldn't have a large steering committee here. That's at a different level. But that project sponsor might be the go-to person for that oversight and direction and championing of the project at the executive level. And we also have the person who's funding the project. Prince 2 calls them the senior user. You could call them the project owner or the business owner. I've heard various names for this person who's funding the project, but not necessarily the right person for oversight and direction, and doesn't necessarily understand the governance process for projects. And so we create this project board that has that joint accountability for the project. And everyone on that project board gets the same information and is involved in decision making. But that project board is still led by that project sponsor or key executive who champions the project. And in that way, we have a decision-making structure. We define roles and responsibilities for everyone within that organization. And we also establish a process for organizing the project and what needs to be done when, and where we're going to review whether the project is still focused on its main objectives. It might look something like this, for example, where you have phases clearly defined. At the end of each phase, you have a stage gate. I'm not necessarily a proponent of the waterfall process in that we do not start the next phase until we've had that stage gate completely done. In some environments, that might indeed be applicable, but not everywhere. You might, at least in this stage gate, define that you do not go any further in the next stage until all the elements of that first phase are completed. So there may indeed be overlap between the phases as long as it's controlled overlap. So we talked about decision-making structure. Along with that, we should also talk about process for transparent communications. We need to have good project performance reporting. We need to agree what that looks like, what risk management looks like, what do we do with our lessons learned, and how do we ensure that our governance framework is being applied appropriately? So a method for conducting audits of that framework. All of that allows for much more efficient use of resources, and that's what we're after at the end of the day. We're after ensuring that projects that we execute are aligned with the overall business direction of the organization, as well as that our resources are being used efficiently. And with a good governance framework, you will have defined roles and responsibilities, appropriate accountabilities and authorities, and we will allow that efficient use of resources through those mechanisms. A good governance framework also includes consideration of the differences between governance for portfolios, governance for programs, and governance of projects, because the reporting structure for each one of those is going to be different.